All right, now let's do some fan questions.
Hey, Chael, this is Yazid from Harvard, Louisiana. Love your channel, love all your content, man. It never gets boring. I want to ask you about my favorite fighter, Khabib Nurmagomedov. After he destroys Tony Ferguson, which I'm almost 100% sure that's what he will do, where does he go after that? George St. Pierre is not going down to 155 anymore, according to Firas Zahabi. So, who's gonna be the person that can give Khabib a problem after he destroys Tony Ferguson?
Well, so there's some good matchups there for Khabib. And it's a fair question because we appear to be in a triangle right now, don't we? Where it's Conor and it's Tony and it's Khabib. But there's other guys that disagree. You know, Donald Cerrone go, hey, this isn't a triangle, it's a square. And all of a sudden, Kevin Lee's going to step in and say, no, to hell with that, it's a pentagon. And then all of a sudden, Justin Gaethje's going to step in and go, what are you boys talking about? Right? I mean, you see where this starts to get pretty interesting pretty fast. Look, that's one of the things about 155 pounds. It is the toughest weight in the entire business. And if it's not, then 145 is. But I mean, you see where that's at. And then you get a guy like Dustin Poirier going, hey, what are you forgetting about me? And you guys get a guy like Dan Hooker going, hey, by the way, I just helped support 57,000 live people, and I got the jump on Al Iaquinta, who went rounds with Khabib. I mean, 155 pounds is something very special. Oh, but I guess we left out Felder and we left out Barboza. I mean, you see the problem. You see the tremendous problem at 155. So you're never going to lack top competition. You do have, when I talk about the triangle of Tony, Khabib, Conor, you have the storyline. Those guys have the story, which means those guys have the mandate of the masses, which means those guys have the attention right now. And that ball could get bounced around. Let's say you're wrong. Let's say you're almost 100% doesn't come through. And Tony beats Khabib. Well, now, at least in theory, you got to do Conor versus Tony. I mean, you see how that can start to become a mess and these guys getting a round robin and start trading it around. And maybe not. Maybe a Hooker steps in there. Maybe a Felder steps in there. Maybe a Gaethje steps in there and just steals everything. But I also think, you know, when you're looking at it matchup-wise, when you're bringing up Khabib, Kevin Lee has to be looked at as one of the more dangerous matchups for Khabib. I mean, are you picturing a scenario in your mind where Khabib just goes and throws Kevin Lee down and then holds him there? Pretty unlikely. Nobody else has been able to do that. I mean, nobody has just take Kevin Lee down and hold him there. So you start looking at the matchups. I mean, they do start to get very compelling. I bring Kevin Lee into this because, I mean, what a difference a day makes. Kevin's written off and his best days were behind him, and then he goes and gets a knockout of the night over a young up-and-comer who had never lost before. I mean, you see, but at 155 pounds, that's what happens. It's one of the reasons that Tony and Khabib are so celebrated right now. Tony's on one hell of a run. Khabib's completely undefeated. Khabib literally has won so many fights I can never remember. Is it 28 fights or did he just win his 29th fight? I can't remember, and I'm good at this thing. But when you go on that kind of a run at 155 pounds, my goodness, this is a Mayweather-esque. This is a Bernard Hopkins-esque and all of Oscar De La Hoya-esque. To go on a run like that, particularly at that weight, which is iron on top of iron. Look, whether I've answered your question or I've just rambled on for a few minutes here, either way, I feel I have proved my point. That is a competitive weight class that will never lack a top contender.
What's up, Chael? Chris here from South Florida. My question pertains about the BMF belt. I know it's past, but if Chael had to pick who should have wrapped the belt around the winner, it obviously not being Dwayne Johnson, no disrespect to The Rock, who would Chael have picked? I thought Nate's pick of Mike Tyson was an exceptional pick. Personally, me, just to keep it within the UFC, I would have picked Michael Bisping. Seems very fitting since he is a BMF who won a belt with one eye. Thank you for taking the time to answer this, Chael.
Okay, I like that. Yeah, sure, Bisping would have been fitting. And Nate's suggestion of Mike Tyson, if you're talking BMF, there's no doubt that would have worked. And you know what? I want to go back to The Rock. I love that The Rock did it. I love the attention that The Rock brought. But The Rock also did something very special, and not just that night. that entire week. He was at the press conference. He was at the weigh-ins. The Rock went out of his way. I'm talking, he had a disciplined humility. He went out of his way to not steal the spotlight, of which he could have done with the raise of an eyebrow. He could have done with one catchphrase. If you smell, right? Everybody wanted to see him. The Rock knew people want to see me, but he was also cognizant of the fact this isn't my night. He could have taken it. He would have helped business. Dana would have had no problem with it. The boys would have had no problem with it. The Rock had a problem with it. The Rock looked at this as though I don't belong. I am lucky and happy to be here. And he carried that through. And it was an act of discipline, and it was incredible. It was respectful, but only when it was done and you could observe the humbleness that The Rock showed. That's when you could, right? Do you understand? It was a very special thing that he did. And I think he deserves a tremendous amount of credit. I think that he's getting it, but it was one of those things where, hey, Rock, just from an average fan, hey, Rock, anytime you want to come back, come on back.
So, Chael, greetings from Birmingham, England. If you didn't already know, someone that's on the UFC roster from Birmingham is Leon Edwards. Now, in a thriving division like the welterweight division, I really struggle to see what Leon Edwards needs to do to climb the rankings even further and make his way towards a title fight. Obviously, he's on an 8-fight win streak, beat Cowboy Cerrone, beat Gunnar Nelson, beat RDA. But looking at the division, Usman and Kobe are tied up with each other. Masvidal's just had a huge win over Nate Diaz, so he's probably going to sit out for a title fight. Tyron Woodley apparently doesn't want to fight Leon Edwards because he doesn't think it will generate enough attention. Ben Askren's retired, so where does Leon go from now? He's on an 8-fight win streak. He deserves something good. So where do you think he should go, and who do you think he should fight next? Thanks.
Yeah, well said. You got no objection here. Now, I do have to tell you, and perhaps something changed, but I did think there was some clarity given to Leon. I thought I read almost 2 weeks ago that he and Tyron Woodley did agree to fight. And I do realize that Tyron had come out and initially said, look, I respect Leon and he's doing everything right. That just, people don't know him enough. And I do remember when Tyron said that, but I believe, and I'm going off the top of my memory here, but I believe things changed. I believe they have agreed to fight to the point that I think we even have a date set. Allow me to check that and get back to you.
Hey, Joe, just a question about Conor McGregor and the build up to his next fight. He's been known to play down his opponents like Chad Mendes. He played down his size. And even Khabib, he said he's got a glass jaw. With the promotion for the Cowboy fight, people are already questioning the quality of his opponent. Cowboy coming off 2 losses, both stoppages. So it makes you think, does Conor McGregor go on the offensive again, or does he have to protect Cowboy's image and justify the quality of his opposition this time? Or does he go back to his usual way of trash talking?
Well, you got to understand, these guys are even Steven, right? Don't forget, people have said short-term memory. You're saying that Cowboy came off of 2 losses. You're right. And I think you pointed out they were both TKO losses. Is that correct? You would be right if you did say that. I would also be right if I told you, so's Conor. Floyd stopped him. Khabib stopped him. And there's more to that story, right? He went over to boxing, a sport he doesn't do, took on the greatest to have ever done it, came back to MMA, took on the greatest to have done it in that division. Right, there's more to it, but can't Cowboy get that same respect? Justin Gaethje's a former champion of the world. He started out 15-0, was the World Series champion. Now you're looking at Tony Ferguson as well. Tony Ferguson was the interim champion that never lost his belt. Oh, and by the way, a lot of people think he's going to go out and be the one to beat Khabib. It's not as though Cowboy wasn't out there doing some heavy lifting. The same thing goes for Conor. Traditionally within this sport, a guy coming off a win, and this includes the undercard. A guy coming off a win takes on another guy coming off a win. A guy coming off a loss takes on another guy coming off a loss. Traditionally, this is not a rule, but I could tell you, Joe Silva, this was kind of a policy that he had. Joe's not in there anymore, but the guys that are do still adhere that Joe was the great to have done this. What was Joe's thought process? Okay, let's copy it. For the most part, that is the way that works. So you are falling in line with the history of the sport. I think in some ways when Gaethje was trying to make his arguments, like, yeah, Gaethje, everything you're saying is true other than the one piece of the policy, which does say Conor's coming off a loss, and you're not. Not completely fair that a guy's success gets in his own way, but I do think in some parts, perhaps in this case, it did.
Hi, Uncle Chael. I'm Amin from Tunisia, a big fan of yours. So I would like to ask the bad guy for his opinion about this. If Khabib manages to defeat Tony early 2020, wouldn't it be a great idea for him to fight Masvidal next? I know it seems a little bit weird, but in case the GSP fight isn't on the table, you got Masvidal, who's a great welterweight, a lethal striker with precision and knockout power. Also, Khabib fits the BMF gimmick really well. You know, he's a tough man. He's raised in the streets of Dagestan. Of course, not as mean as the streets of Westland, Oregon, but still. And it'll be a great opportunity for him to become champ and with a great finale of 30-0. What do you think about that?
Well, hell yes, that fight works. Now, you caught me off guard, and I by no means will co-sign any kind of prediction that fight ever happens, but let's work the pieces through just for fun here. And don't forget, George's belt would not have to be up for grabs. I know you were saying champ. I love what you're doing there, but if the information that we have been given, and within this sport we follow the rules that we make up on the spot, but for the information we've been given, the BMF is now retired and it's not coming back, supposedly. But let's take a closer look at Masvidal versus Khabib. Masvidal spent his entire life as a 155-pounder until just recently. I don't believe he has any interest in going back to 155, but if you're asking me, would that storyline work? Would George going down to 155 sell? Would it be compelling? Would it be competitive? Yeah. People would stop what they were doing. They'd mark that on their calendar. They'd be sure that they tuned in. 155 right now doesn't need George. It doesn't need anybody. It is stacked to the teeth. So if you were looking at this from a different perspective, which is Khabib goes up and Khabib challenges for the BMF and doesn't put his own belt on the line, I don't think that George would have to be the way to go. What does it work? Sure. Does it work if that's your question? Yes. Yes, it does. But if Khabib was to go up to 170, I do think it'd be very appropriate that he slid right into a championship fight. Whether that was with Kamaru or that was with Colby, however those boys figure that out, I think that would be more appropriate. But I would suggest for you that would be less compelling in some ways than putting George in with one of those guys. I just feel right now, I guess my final analysis to you is that 170 pounds is handled. They are taken care of for the foreseeable future. Oh, and guess what? So is 155 pounds. I don't think either division needs cross-promotional help.
Hey, Uncle Joe, what's up? You mentioned about Fighter of the Year and asked if there was anyone you hadn't quite considered. I know this guy probably won't count because I'm including the end of 2018, but I really feel Francis Ngannou ain't quite getting the credit he deserves for his last 12 months when you think he came off 2 big losses, lost his confidence, criticised by his trainer, criticised by the president of the company, takes a hard fight against Curtis Blades in China, takes him out in 45 seconds, then beats Cain Velasquez in under 30 seconds and JDS in just over a minute. We're talking about 2 of the best heavyweights we've seen and also a top heavyweight contender. And he only needed 2.5 minutes to beat them all. Like I said, I just feel he's not quite getting the credit he deserves. I actually think he's done more than enough to warrant a title fight. Do you think he deserves a title fight? And if he had done all of that in a calendar year, would you be considering him as Fighter of the Year? Thanks.
Hell yes. Well done, my friend. And let me add to that. When you're telling the Francis story of the short term of his UFC career, and it has been pretty short, right? It seems like it's gone faster, been long. It hasn't. It's been very short. You have to also consider that he was anointed the face of the company with only a few wins, and only one of those wins on a main card television. He was anointed the next coming of the heavyweight division, which is the most coveted division in all of sport. If you think he didn't feel a ton of pressure from that, sure he was honored, and sure he was flattered, and sure he was being recognized, but he's still a human being. He's still figuring himself out. And then he's got to walk out there with Stipe Miocic. His name's in the marquee. Guy comes out of Cameroon, all of a sudden his name's on a marquee, a sold-out arena, and people are expecting him to grab the torch and run with it for the foreseeable future. A lot of pressure put on him. When he failed in that, I thought the fact that he rebounded and jumped in there with Derek Lewis was a good sign. I realized that fight laid an egg. I was there live. I get it. But for me, and if you look at the body of work of Francis, you have to take that fight and throw it out. Never happened. That was not him. I would also agree that wasn't Derek Lewis. Something weird happened in there. We've seen those weird things happen before. Go see Houston Alexander and Kimbo Slice. By example, two exciting guys. You put them together. Oh my goodness, they stink the joint up. We've seen it before. For whatever reason, I do think you have to throw that fight out. Now let's go back to what you said. You started talking about JDS and stopping him. You start talking about Cain Velasquez and stopping him. Do you understand how scared guys are of Cain Velasquez? That's a question. I'm going to give you a second to take that in. I would like an answer. If you are not aware of the fear that fellow fighters have of Cain Velasquez, fighters will not talk bad about Cain behind his back, and I don't mean in public on something like this. I'm talking about in a closed-door session. You will not get a fighter to say something bad about Cain for fear that it will get back to him. I am not giving you... That's the truth. They are scared to death of him. For whatever, he's a super nice guy. They're scared to death of him. Francis walked out there and put it on the line for 5 rounds. And I realized he didn't need more than 60 seconds. I'm telling you, he signed up for 5 rounds with this guy and walked out there like a gangster to do it. I totally agree with you of the credit and praise that Francis deserves. And while you are talking about his trainer being hard on him or even Dana being hard on him, I do think in the final analysis, perhaps Francis owes them a thank you. Because we have seen the wheels come off the bus pretty fast when a guy out of nowhere gets exposure, which means now he's got opportunity. And these new friends that he thinks that he has, all that means is he has access to a higher level of scumbag. And now he's got a few more dollars in his pocket. Look, it's a tough spot. It's a very real thing. And I think the fact that those guys brought him back around and splashed some cold water in his face, I think if Francis was to be fair, he should take your compliment. That was reasonable. He should take my compliment. But he should also probably tell the trainer and tell Dana, hey guys, thanks.
Hi mates, how you doing? Big fan of the show. One quick thing, his name is pronounced Khabib, not Khabib or Habib. Khabib. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, my question is, what would the UFC look like without Dana White? Curious to hear your thoughts. Thanks again. Love the show.
Are you sure about that? Habib? It's not Khabib. It's spelled with a K. And I realize there's I'm open to being wrong, but you're sure it's not Khabib? I've heard guys say it both ways. Do you remember when we were going through the Vanderlei versus Wanderlei? I still don't know the answer to that. I think it's spelled with a W, but I think he calls himself Vanderlei. Look, I'm happy to get it right. Names do matter. I know I'm working on Kamaru and I'm working on Yair. Names matter. Otherwise, we'd all just walk around and call each other Walter, right? But I don't know about that. Are you sure it's not Khabib? I know this guy. I've known him for a number of years. I always call him Khabib. I feel like he would correct me. Then again, he always calls me Chael, and I never correct him. So, okay. Now, back to the question. Where would the UFC would be without Dana White? I mean, you got to understand how many hours he puts in. Dana looks like he's got this wonderful life. Dana's life is only wonderful because he likes what he's doing. Let me assure you, you don't want that job. You do not want that job unless you can get away with 3 hours of sleep a night, if you don't mind going 7 days a week, if you understand doing international business, the hours of 9 to 5 in America are not the same as 9 to 5 in other parts of the world. So you are literally going around the clock. If you can accept that, if you can live life with a phone in each hand that is going off nonstop and people coming at you, and you've got to find a way to compartmentalize and build something, have a vision and move forward. Okay, great. I'll listen to you that you want to do that, but it is something very unique. And there's no college you can go to and major in fight promotion. There's no library you can go to and check out a book on fight promotion. There's only about 4 or 5 men alive that know how to do it. And I swear to goodness, it's a skill like playing a musical instrument to a high level. It's something you've either got it or you don't, and you really can't learn it.
Chael, on a recent episode of the Joe Rogan podcast, Joe Rogan recalls a story where one of his comedian friends, Ari Shafir, was going through a few classes of jiu-jitsu and he caught a staph infection. The way Joe noticed it was because they were playing pool one night. Ari Shafir was limping, and Joe asked him, "Why are you limping?" And he said, "It's just a spider bite that's been bugging me." So when Joe takes a look at it, he immediately tells him to go to the emergency room because that was not a spider bite. It was most likely a staph infection that had been growing, and it was most likely through jiu-jitsu training. What are some precautionary measures that a fighter or person in training should take to prevent staph? And what are some measures that MMA facilities today should be taking or can be taking to help fighters prevent any form of disease or infection? Big fan.
Okay, I want to answer this, but I have to give a disclosure up front. I mean, this is somewhat of a serious topic, and I'm going to give you a colloquial's opinion, but I've been in wrestling rooms since I was 9 years old, and they are mat rooms, right? Jiu-jitsu, MMA, they're all the same. Matted. One thing about that is they are almost a petri dish for germs. I mean, you have to understand, germs love to be in somewhere where there's moisture. And most things about MMA and matted areas is they don't have tremendous ventilation. Right, the walls are usually all matted off. There's not windows in there. There's not things like this. And the sweat that goes down and gets in between the crevices and cracks, as much as you clean those mats and you sweep them and you bleach them and you do everything right, you can see where mold and fungus can start to grow. And it just becomes a daily battle. So to answer your question, you want a clean mat. You want to do as good as you can. Bleach is generally the way to go. There are some other mat cleaners out there. Bleach is generally the really good one. And then you want to shower as soon as you're done. You want to have soap. Some guys will go as far as iodine, which is a tremendous medical cleaner. They will clean medical instruments in hospitals and things like this. But I like your Joe example because if you know what you're looking for and you keep your eye on it, you can identify it. And staph can come in all sorts of different levels. There's staph you can take an antibiotic and 2 days later, it's a distant memory. But there's other staph. You guys know Vinny Magliash. Vinny had a staph. They almost had to cut his arm off. I mean, it was that he almost had to get amputated. He was in the hospital, living on IVs 24/7. It was a tremendous deal. So there's just different levels of staph. And Joe Rogan does point out a good point, or I guess Ari pointed out to him where he said, "Hey, I thought it was a spider bite." That's actually what staph will largely look like. It will largely look like a spider bite. However, it will typically come in a cluster. You'll typically have 3 or more spots. And if you have that and staph is red and it's raised and it itches, I mean, it's a lot like a spider bite. That's a very, very fair example. I can see where that accident would be made. But also to Joe's point, get into the doctor right away. Get on your antibiotics. And generally speaking, but you can beat it.
His cross is like a freight train. He moves just like a dancer. Before you ask a question, he already knows the answer. He's never lost, he cannot fail. And that's the facts of Uncle Chael. Say, okay, great, to far and wide. You're welcome, here he comes.